course, you got to have these little tinges of Spanish in it in order to play real good jazz. Jazz has a foundation that must be very prominent, especially with the bass sections, in order to give a great background. Plus what's called riffs today, which was known as figures. But figures hasn't always been in the dance bands. I'll give you an idea what the idea of Spanish there is in the blues.
Now, when people refer to the Latin influence in American music, most people point to that statement made by Jelly Roll Morton, where he says that there is Spanish in jazz. And not only did he say that, he said there is Spanish in the blues. Now, I take some issue with that because when you look at the origin of the blues, it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't flow like that. But what Jelly Roll Morton is doing, he's taking his interpretation of what he would call a Latin rhythm and he's applying it to the blues. And so he's kind of in a way misrepresenting what the blues consist of or what the original way the blues was played. Keep in mind, the blues was brought into New Orleans after the Civil War and where there were free people coming to find work in New Orleans. They brought the blues.
About the same time, New Orleans musicians began to hear the blues. A steady stream of refugees from the Mississippi Delta was now pouring into New Orleans, in flight from Jim Crow laws. People for whom laboring on the city docks promised a better life than any they could hope to have back home chopping cotton or cutting cane for someone else's profit. The blues was part of their baggage.
The blues is about sculpting meaning out of a situation that seems to defy your being able to find meaning in it. Black people, since the end of the Civil War, searching for an aesthetic. They're searching for an aesthetic that will free them of minstrelsy, free them of the burden of minstrelsy, free them of the degradation of minstrelsy. What emerges from that is a form called the blues. It's a very useful form. It's elastic. You can do a lot with it because it's simple.
The blues is an utterly American form, built on just 3 chords, most often arranged in 12-bar sequences called choruses, that allows for an infinite number of variations.
And it's a form that in order for you to really be able to pull it off well, involves more than just technique. You have to have a certain kind of feeling with it. So you create this kind of basic language through which and on which they can construct all kinds of things.
You have to have that blues.
So the point I'm making is that the blues is not original to New Orleans. For whatever reason, he felt the need to say that it was a Spanish, tinged to even the blues. Now, keep in mind, we always have to understand New Orleans it's not the whole world. It's not the whole United States. There's a big country out there. And there were other rhythms that were very similar to what they would call the Spanish tinge. That's another word for the habanera rhythm. And when you look up where the habanera comes from, you'll discover that it comes from Africa. Now, what I want you to do is listen to the way I'm sure Jelly Roll Morton was introduced to the habanera rhythm and how, if you took away that new interpretation of the rhythm and break it down to what it is originally, an African rhythm, you could tell where it came from. Now, if you listen closely, you would have heard this rhythm. Boom, 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 boom. That is the rhythm. That is the habanera rhythm. All right, let's check it out when you play it on bongos. And all of a sudden, it starts to sound more so like African.
The rhythm we're learning today is called the habanera. It is a rhythm that is popular all over the world, but the Cuban name for it is habanero. It goes like this.
Now, all of a sudden, it doesn't sound so Spanish. So this is what we're talking about. We're just basically talking about a particular rhythm being applied to European music, and they just simply call it the habanera. Let's look at a little bit of the history and how the habanera was formulated.
In essence, it preserves the sound of the day. Cuban pianist Manuel Saumel did just that for the Cuban contradanza, which came to Cuba by way of the Haitian revolt.
The contradanza was brought here by the French, but here in Cuba, the musicians were mainly black or colored mulattoes. So, of course, these black musicians, they put something of their own musicality in the French contradanza, and that's how the Cuban contradanza was born.
To provide more context to what you just heard, it's important to understand how these rhythms came to Cuba. The narrator said that during the Haitian Revolution, French slave masters and their slaves fled Haiti for New Orleans and Cuba. It was these Haitians that brought the French contradanza to Cuba. The Haitian slaves provided the rhythm. That is the habanera. That's what we're talking about. The Cubans adopted the rhythms bought by the French, and then they called it the Cuban contradanza. Sometime later, they named these rhythms the habanera and the tricilo. The tricilo is a Spanish term to describe how quarter notes in a bar are divided into 3 equal parts. Rhythms such as the 3-3-2 and the 3-3 are examples of this rhythm. You will find the 3-3 rhythm very common in the music of the Gullah Geechee people, the ring shout. Now listen to that rhythm. This is the 3-3 rhythm. This is called a tricilo as well. 2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2-3. All right? Don't let the word tricilo fool you. This is in America. The Gullah Geechee. Now let's talk about a rhythm that we also don't think is original to America. We are talking about the 3-2 clave. Wherever the Africans were bought during the slave trade throughout the diaspora, they all had a similar bell rhythm within their drumming culture. These bell rhythms became what we call the clave. The 3-2 clave is widely associated with Cuban music. However, many people are unaware that the 3-2 clave was present in America. After the banning of the drums, the rhythms of the people were not extinguished. They were simply transferred to either the body or other musical instruments. Within ham bone, the 3-2 clave is clearly heard. Bo Diddley transferred that rhythm onto the guitar and created the Bo Diddley beat.
it's okay. And I do agree with that. I think it's a really, it's storytelling. It's a very old, ancient folk tale, folk singing tradition of taking songs and changing them, and it mutates over time, and you can trace this kind of ancestry of sound through many, many, many songs. And in this one, I straight up took from Bo Diddley's beat, which is called the ham bone beat, because blues musicians used to hit their bodies. They'd hit their thighs. I can't do it. If you look up ham bone beat on YouTube, you'll see some amazing videos of musicians using their bodies as drum kits, basically. And this is the ham bone beat that Bo Diddley used in a lot of his music, but he apparently heard it when he was 11 years old, and that was him hooked on the ham bone beat, and he brought it to the world, and of course it's that. And it's used everywhere.
Let me introduce to you Alan Jabbour. He's an American musician and folklorist, and he's the founding director of the American Folk Life Center at the Library of Congress. While a graduate student, he became interested in American fiddle styles and traveled in North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia to record instrumental folk music, folk song, and folklore on tape. This collection, particularly rich in traditional fiddle tunes from the Upper South, is now in the archives of the folk culture at the Library of Congress. Now I want to play a portion of his presentation where he talks about the contributions of African American fiddle players to American music. He talks about the rhythmic pattern that they introduced, which is the 3-3-2 pattern. This is the same pattern found in the habanera, proving once again that the 3-3-2 rhythm was not exclusive to Latin America. Now, I want to apologize. There may be some skips in the presentation in the video, but it's not me. I just want you guys to know that.
Now we'll go back and start picking it apart here. The main thing that I'll illustrate here, and you'll have to take my word for it, that it really appears throughout the fiddling of this region, that it's really embedded in my style. I can't not do this kind of syncopation, but let me illustrate how it works. It's essentially drawing the bow in groups of notes. You know, you can play each note as a separate stroke of the bow, like there, I'm playing a different stroke of the bow for each note, or you can group the notes together. I'm doing two to the bow stroke, right? You with me? Okay, all right. Or I could even do four. So But that's all, how shall I say, four square, right? But what the fiddlers of the Upper South do, and they do it consistently from Virginia to Texas, including the old people like Henry Reed who learned their style before the turn of the century. What they do is this complicated bowing pattern where they group the bow into groups of 3 and 2, so that a group of 8 would be divided up not into 2s and 4s, but into, say, 3, 3, and 2. 3, 6, 8. So you could do. There's 3, 3 separate, and then 3 slurred, and then 2 separate. It's subtle, it sort of goes by fast, but what it does, in effect, is create this pattern. Grouping things into 3s and 2s creates not just syncopation generically, but a certain particular kind of syncopation, and it's the kind of syncopation that we now associate with American music generally. Most people, when they hear it, they think, well, it must be African American, and maybe it came from jazz, or maybe from blues, or maybe real old time stuff like ragtime. Actually, it did come from African Americans. It's clearly an African American contribution to the South, but it came even earlier by a century. It came in the early 19th century, and it came in fiddling in the Upper South. And it worked its way from fiddling out into other kinds of folk music in the South, and ultimately into popular music, beginning in waves with the minstrel stage and going right on through the various waves of the 20th century. So this syncopation that's now associated with American music on a worldwide basis really, I believe, began with fiddling shared by black and white together in the Upper South as they, through art, forged a unified culture that connected them together. It's an amazing thing that they did that, considering the things that kept them apart. It's clear that art was the one area where they were experimenting with symbolizing their living together on this land.
All right, let me do this demonstration right quick. I want to use the 3-3-2 rhythm, which the fiddle instructor talked about in the previous video, but I want to apply it to modern day music because he alluded to the fact that this particular rhythm is prominent in American music. Okay, and he also emphasized the fact that it was the African American fiddle players that brought this particular technique to fiddle playing in the United States, at least for the most part in the Upper South of the United States. Okay, now, believe it or not, the 3-3-2 rhythm is very similar to the habanera rhythm. Now, the question might be asked, well, did the habanera influence the African American musicians in the South? Absolutely not. The fact remains that the majority of African Americans are descendants of African people as well. Okay, so what I want to do, I'm going to play a couple of chords emphasizing the 3-3-2 pattern so you can identify it. And then I'll play a song that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. One, two, three, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. All right. So that's the count. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Okay? Now you'll hear that in this particular song as well. Are you really sure? Can a love that lasted for so long still endure? Do I really care? Hey, hey, let's talk about the distraction going on
in the dark, oh, in the dark, and I keep hearing footsteps, baby, in the dark, oh, in the dark.
So that's the 3-3-2 rhythm on a modern day song. My purpose in doing this video was to challenge the standard narrative that Latin culture influenced American music. This narrative gained a lot of traction on the belief that the enslaved Africans in America did not retain their African music culture. This belief by many was largely based on the implementation of the Negro Act of 1740, which outlawed the playing of drums. Now, due to this improper education, many believe that the enslaved Africans never played drums in America. So how can they create these rhythms? It is said that the first Africans came to America in 1619. If you do the math, you can at least say with some certainty that drumming in the South was allowed for at least 120 years before drums were banned. We cannot forget the Africans who were in New Orleans before the arrival of the Haitian refugees in 1810. Let's not forget about the Gullah Geechee and the enslaved population in New York State region and the Hudson Valley areas of the United States, where the celebration of Pinkster was observed. I am in no way discounting Jelly Roll Morton's experience and how he was introduced to the habanera rhythm. I'm only offering other means of influence that could have come from within the United States. In this video, I have shown, for example, the 3-3-2, the 3-3, and the 3-2 rhythm that was created and developed among the enslaved Africans in America. The thing that I find so puzzling is that whenever Black Americans do anything great, people from the African diaspora try to attach themselves to those achievements, oftentimes saying, we are all the same people, it's part of my heritage. However, there is tremendous pushback from the diaspora when I mention, or anybody like me mentions, that these rhythms that I spoke about earlier are native to America as well. They don't want to hear that. In this respect, they don't see Black Americans as part of the diaspora. For many Latinos to believe that their culture and music influenced the development of American music, this is surely something that they can be proud of. I'm sure they would perceive any information that goes against or that counters that narrative damaging to their sense of pride. So I'm sure they will continue to reject it out front. All I can say, the history is the history. What more can I say? So listen, if you haven't already, subscribe, definitely thumb up the video, share, protect, gatekeep Black American culture. With that being said, peace.
Did you know that dry cleaning was invented in 1821 by a Black man named Thomas Jennings? Thomas Jennings owned a dry cleaning business in New York City and was the first Black man in the United States to be granted a patent. Thomas L. Jennings was an African-American tradesman and abolitionist in New York. He operated and owned a tailoring business. In 1821, he was one of the first African-Americans to be granted a patent for his method of dry cleaning.